the spring of 1889, in a wind-scoured corner of the Idaho Territory, where the rails ran north toward the silver country, and the sagebrush swallowed everything the railroad no longer wanted, a young woman counted $4 into the palm of a clerk and bought a building that 3 counties had agreed was worthless. The depot at Crail Siding had stood boarded for 11 years. Its windows were planked over with gray pine. Its platform sagged where the frost had heaved the piers, and the painted name above its door had weathered down to a ghost of letters no one could read. The clerk took her money the way a man takes a thing he expects to regret selling, and he told her plainly that she had just purchased the privilege of tearing it down herself. Her name was Della Hart, and she was 28 years old, and she had come to that siding with everything she owned, strapped to a single mule and a satchel of tools that had belonged to a man who was 3 years dead. She did not argue with the clerk. She folded the receipt and put it inside her coat against her chest, where the cold could not curl it, and she walked the half-mile of overgrown track to look at what was hers. What she did not yet know was that the building she had bought for $4 held the answer to a robbery that had ruined 9 families and salted the ground of an entire mining camp, and that the men who had walked free for 11 years had walked free precisely because everyone believed the depot was empty. Stay with me, because the thing sealed inside that depot had been waiting longer than she had been grown, and it had been waiting for hands exactly like hers. Della had not been raised to want much. She had been raised in a railroad town further south by a grandfather named Ovid Hart, who had kept the books and the locks and the strong boxes for a freight line that no longer existed, and who had taught her from the time she could hold a pen the 2 things he believed a person could not be cheated out of once they owned them. The first was a steady hand with figures. The second was the patient knowledge of how a lock is made, and therefore how it can be opened by someone who respects it, rather than forces it. He had been a quiet man with ink in the creases of his fingers, and when the fever took him in the winter of her 25th year, he had left her his ledger hand, his ring of picks and tension wrenches wrapped in oilcloth, and a single sentence she carried like a coin worn smooth. "A locked thing is only a question," he had said, "and a question is only waiting for the right person to ask it properly." She had asked a great many locks that question since. She had worked as a copyist and a bookkeeper in 3 towns, bent over other men's figures by lamplight for wages that kept her fed and little more. And she had quietly opened a seized strongbox for a widow whose husband had died without telling her where the deed was. And the deed had been inside, and the widow had kept her farm because of it. She had opened a jammed church poor box that the deacons had been ready to break apart, saving them the box and the shame both. She had earned a small reputation among people who had no money for lawyers and no patience for being told a thing could not be done. The kind of reputation that travels quietly along the roads that the prosperous never use. It was that reputation in a roundabout way that had brought her north. A letter had reached her, passed hand to hand across half a territory, from an old man who remembered her grandfather and who had heard she could open what others could not. The letter named a place. The letter named a depot, and the letter said, in a cramped and careful hand, that there was a man still living who would pay a great deal to be sure that depot was never opened at all. That was enough. Curiosity in Della Hart was not a light thing. It was the engine her grandfather had built into her, and it pulled harder than fear. The depot at Crail Siding had been built in 1871 to serve a silver camp called Esther's Reach, a cluster of mines and a town of perhaps 600 souls that had clawed a living out of a steep canyon 9 miles up the grade. For 10 years, the depot had been the throat through which everything passed, or came down. Supplies went up, and once a month on the down train, a strong box of payroll came in from the territorial bank to be carried up the canyon by wagon. and paid out to the men who broke the rock. It was an ordinary arrangement, the kind that held 100 camps together, and it held Esther's Reach together until the September of 1878, when the payroll came in on the down train and never went up the canyon at all. The story, as the country told it, was simple and ugly. The payroll, near $11,000 in coin and notes, had been signed for at the depot by the station master and was to be locked in the depot safe overnight before the morning wagon took it up. By morning, the station master was gone. The safe stood open and empty, and a single set of wagon tracks led away to the south and dissolved in the river gravel. The territory decided the station master had taken it. They printed his name on bills and nailed them to posts from there to the Oregon line, and the name on those bills was Thomas Oldus Reed, and no living man ever saw him again. The mine could not make its payroll. The bank would not extend it. By the first snow, Esther's Reach was a ghost, and the families who had trusted their wages to that strongbox scattered with nothing, and the depot at Crail Siding was boarded up and left to the weather, a place of bad luck that no one would buy. 11 years. That was how long the silver country had carried the certainty that a thief named Reed had run off with the wages of the men who dug the silver. Della Hart bought the building that certainty was built on for the price of a good meal, and she walked its sagging platform in the spring light, and she put her hand flat against the planked-over door, and she felt, the way her grandfather had taught her to feel, that the building was holding its breath. I will tell you now what most people would have done. They would have pried the planks for the firewood, knocked the place flat for the lumber, and never once wondered why a building so plainly empty had been boarded so very carefully from the inside. Della wondered. That was the whole of the difference, and it was everything. The boards over the main door had been nailed, she saw, in a pattern that was not the work of a man in a hurry. 11 years of weather had silvered them, but the nails were set close and true, the way a careful hand sets them, and they were set over a door that already had a good iron lock. A man tearing down a depot does not nail planks over a locked door he's about to abandon. A man does that when he wants the door to stay shut and wants no one to think it worth opening. She stood with that contradiction a long while. Then she took the claw of her grandfather's smaller bar and began gently to lift the planks one at a time, drawing each nail whole rather than splitting the wood, because a thing worth understanding is worth not breaking. It took her the better part of a day to clear the door, and the work was slow because she would not let it be fast. The spring sun crossed the platform and warmed the silvered planks under her hands, and the nails came out one by one with a small groan each, 11 years of weather having married them to the wood. She kept the planks in a stack and the nails in a tin, because a careful person does not scatter what might be wanted again, and because her grandfather had taught her that the way a person treats small things is the way they will treat large ones when no one is watching. Behind the planks, she found what she had expected and what no one in 11 years had bothered to look for. The lock was a good one, a railroad mortise lock of the kind her grandfather had kept by the dozen, heavy and square, and meant to outlast the men who turned its key. And it had been locked, and the key was long gone. She knelt to it in the failing light, unrolled the oilcloth across her knee, and chose a tension wrench and a pick the way another woman might choose a needle and thread. A locked thing is only a question. She set the wrench, felt for the pins, and asked. The lock gave a little after 20 minutes, the way a stubborn one does. The first pin setting with a click she felt more in her wrist than heard in her ear. The second came easier, as second things often do once the first has shown the way. The third fought her. It was worn and rust-stiffened, seized half a turn from where it needed to be, and a hasty hand would have snapped a pick in it and ended the day. She did not hurry. She eased the tension off and let the pin fall and began again. And she breathed slow and let the metal tell her what it wanted rather than telling it. The patience in her hands, a thing she had inherited as surely as the tools themselves. Sweat stood on her lip, though the air was cold. The light through the clear door had gone from gold to gray. When the last pin set and the cylinder turned under her hand, the bolt drew back with a sound like a held word finally spoken, and the door of the Crail Siding Depot, sealed for 11 years, swung inward on a darkness that smelled of dust and old iron and the particular cold of air that has not moved in a very long time. She did not go in at once. She had learned that from him too. She stood in the doorway and let the daylight reach as far into the room as it would. And she looked. And what the light found, in the still and the dust, was a room that had not been emptied at all. The depot had been left as a working office on the night it was sealed. A pot-bellied stove stood cold in the corner with a kettle on it. The kettle still holding, she would find, a finger of water gone to rust-stained ice, and then to nothing across the years. A coat hung on a peg by the door, a man's wool coat, gone stiff with the years and pale at the shoulders where some long-ago damp had reached it. A schedule board on the wall still held the chalk times of trains that had stopped running before she was grown, the chalk gone soft and ghostly, but the figures still there for anyone who cared to read them. A tin cup sat on the desk beside a dried inkwell. A chair stood pushed back from the desk at an angle, as though the man who had risen from it meant to return within the hour. Everything in the room spoke of a working day, interrupted and never resumed, a moment caught and held like an insect in amber, and against the far wall, square and black and patient, stood the safe. It was not open. The story the country told had the safe standing open and empty by morning. The safe Della Hart was looking at was shut, and its dial was set, and across its face someone had scratched, in letters made with a nail or a knife point, 3 words that stopped her breath in her chest. She crossed the room to read them in the dimness, and she struck a match. And in the small, flaring light she read what a dead man had wanted the next person to know. The words were, "Not read. Paid." She stood in the cold of that room a long time with the match burning down toward her fingers, and the whole of the country's certainty turned over in the dark, like a thing rolling off a table. If you have ever been told a story about yourself that was not true, and watched the world believe it, you know the particular silence that filled that room. Sit with it a moment, because she did, and then I will tell you what she did next. What Della did next was the thing her grandfather had built her to do. She did not run for the county. She did not shout the news down the empty track. She lit the lamp she found by the door, trimmed the wick, and she began, methodically, to read the room the way she would read a ledger, because a sealed room is only a question and she meant to ask it properly. The code on the peg held in its inner pocket a folded paper gone soft as cloth. She drew it out with care, for paper that old will part like wet ash under a rough hand, and she unfolded it on the desk by the lamp one slow crease at a time. It was a receipt, signed and dated the 11th of September, 1878, in 2 hands. One hand acknowledged delivery of the payroll, $11,040 to the depot at Crail Siding. The other hand acknowledged it in turn, the careful, round script of a man signing for what he meant to keep safe, and the name under that second signature was T.A. Reed, Station Master. It was the receipt the Territory had said proved his guilt. He had signed for the money. He had been the last to hold it, and he had folded the proof of it into his coat and hung the coat on the peg and never come back for it. And that was the first thing that did not fit the story. Because a thief does not preserve the paper that hangs him. A thief burns it. A thief carries it to the bottom of a river. Only an innocent man keeps the receipt that names him, because only an innocent man believes the truth will one day be worth having. She set the receipt on the desk and went on. The desk drawers were locked and she opened them, one after another, with the patience of a woman who has all the time the dead can give her. The top drawer held the ordinary debris of a working office, pen nibs and a dried inkwell, and a tin of pastilles. The second held a stack of waybills in order by date. And the third, the deep-bottomed drawer, held a single object wrapped in a flour sack. And when she unwound the cloth, she found a ledger bound in black board, the twin of the kind her grandfather had kept, and she knew before she opened it that this was the thing the letter had meant. This was the last ledger of the Crail Siding Depot, and the man who would pay a great deal to keep that depot shut had spent 11 years believing it had burned. She opened it on the desk under the lamp, and she read it through the night, and the kettle stayed cold on the stove, and outside the spring wind worked at the eaves, and page by careful page a dead station master told her what had really happened to the wages of Esther's Reach. The lamp threw her shadow huge against the schedule board, and the cold of the sealed room crept up through her boots, and still she read, turning each page with the edge of her thumb, the way her grandfather had turned the pages of his own ledgers, gently, as if the paper were owed respect. The hand in the book changed as she read. The early entries were even and unhurried, the round, confident script of a man who took pride in keeping a clean record. Then, near the night of the robbery, the letters grew smaller and pressed harder into the page, as though the man writing them had felt the country tilting under him, and had set down each word like a man driving a stake into ground that was sliding away. Thomas Reed had been, the ledger showed, exactly the sort of man the territory found it convenient to hang in absence. He was meticulous. He recorded everything. He recorded the payroll coming in on the down train, and he recorded locking it in the safe, and then, in an entry dated the small hours of the 12th of September, in a hand that had begun to hurry, he recorded something that no thief would ever write down. He recorded that the district superintendent of the line, a man named Halloran, had come to the depot after dark with 2 others and an order on company paper, and had demanded the payroll be released to them for transfer to the bank at the county seat, by reason, the order said, of a default the mine had supposedly entered. Reed had refused. The payroll was the mine's, signed and sealed, and no superintendent's order could redirect it, so they had taken it from him. They had not simply robbed him. That was the cold genius of it, and Della felt the shape of it come clear as she read. Halloran had taken the $11,000 under color of a company order, leaving Reed a copy of that order so the man would have his proof, and then Halloran had ridden south and let the country draw the obvious conclusion that the station master had run with the cash. The order in Reed's hand meant nothing once Reed was a wanted man whose word was worth nothing. A thief's protest of innocence convicts him further, and Reed, understanding within a day that he had been made the door through which the theft escaped, had done the only thing a meticulous man could do. He had written it all down. He had countersigned the superintendent's order to prove it real. He had sealed the order and the receipt and the full account into the ledger, locked the ledger in the drawer, locked the safe over the few coins that remained, scratched his denial into its face, and then he had boarded the depot from the inside and gone out a back window into a country that wanted him dead, and he had never been seen again because a hunted innocent man and a fled guilty one leave exactly the same empty track. The ledger held the order itself, pasted to a page, the company letterhead faded but legible, signed by D.M. Halloran, district superintendent. It held the names of the 2 men who had come with him. And on its last written page, in a hand-grown feint, Thomas Reed had written a single line to whoever might one day open what he had sealed. He had written, "I kept it true so that someone could set it right. I could not." Della Hart closed the ledger as the gray came up in the planked windows, and she understood that she had bought, for $4, the one thing $11,000 and 11 years had not been able to destroy, which was the truth, kept true by a dead man's care and waiting for a hand that knew how to open a locked thing without breaking it. She did not yet know whether D.M. Halloran still lived. She found out within a week, and the finding came easier than she feared, because a man who has prospered does not hide. Halloran had left the railroad 2 years after the robbery and had used his sudden comfort to buy into freight and land, and he was, in the spring of 1889, a man of standing in the county seat, a man who sat on the bank's board and gave to the church and was called, by people who did not know what Della now knew, a builder of the country. He was the man, she had no doubt, who had once offered to pay a great deal to be sure the Crail Depot was never opened. He had reason. The ledger named him in his own superintendent's hand. Here the country's old story would have had her ride into town and denounce him from the street. And here is where Della Hart was her grandfather's child, and not the country's. She had learned that an accusation is a thing a powerful man can break, and a document is a thing he cannot. She did not go to Halloran. She went first to find the families. This is the part of the work that took her longest, and it is the part she would later say mattered most. 9 families had lost wages when Esther's Reach died. She meant to find what was left of them. She rode the silver country through the spring and into the summer, with the ledger wrapped in oilcloth against her chest, and she found them scattered like seed on stony ground. Some had died. Some had moved on past finding. Still, she found a blacksmith's widow in a town 2 valleys over, a gray woman named Mercy Tolliver, who kept a boarding house, and who had never stopped believing her husband had been cheated and not abandoned. When Della laid the receipt and the order on the woman's kitchen table and explained, plainly and without flourish, what the depot had held, Mercy Tolliver did not weep. She got up and crossed to the window and stood with her back to the room a long while, and then she said, in a voice gone rough, that she had buried her man's good name 11 years before. She buried the rest of the country's lies, and she had not thought to live long enough to dig it up again. She found a man who had been a boy of 10 in Esther's Reach, and remembered the morning the wages did not come, and his father weeping in the doorway, a sound he said he had never been able to forget. His father a hard man who had not wept before or after. The man was grown now with children of his own, and the memory still sat in him like a stone. And when Della told him the truth of it, he was quiet for a long moment, and then asked her carefully, as if afraid of the answer, whether his father had been a fool to trust the railroad with his pay. No, she told him. His father had trusted an honest arrangement that a dishonest man had broken, and there was no foolishness in that. Only the ordinary trust that holds a country together until someone with power decides to spend it. The man nodded slowly and did not speak again for a while, and when he did, it was to ask how he could help. And she found, in a poor street in the county seat itself, an old man named Asa Combs, who had been the camp's assier and who had signed the original payroll manifest. He lived alone above a harness shop, his eyes gone weak, his hands gone to tremor, and when Della unwrapped the ledger and showed him the superintendent's order, pasted into its page, he leaned close over it and read it twice, and then put his face in his hands, because for 11 years he had wondered if he had somehow miscounted the money and started the ruin himself. He had checked his own figures in his sleep 1,000 times. He had carried a guilt that was never his to carry. When he lowered his hands, his weak eyes were wet, and he said only that he had wondered every day of those 11 years where the error had been. And now he knew there had been no error, only a theft dressed up as one, and that the knowing was worth more to him than any money the world could return. Asa Combs became her witness and her ally. He was old, and his hands shook, but his mind was iron, and he knew the names in that ledger, and he knew the men still living who would remember. He gave up his rooms above the harness shop for whole afternoons and worked beside her at a borrowed table, the two of them laying out documents in rows like a game of patience. The assayer's failing eyes close over the paper, and Della's steady hand copying out fair, clean versions of what the originals showed. Together, they did the patient work that no accusation could have done. They found the bank's own record of the deposit Halloran had made 2 months after the robbery, a sum that matched the missing payroll, closely enough that no honest accounting could explain it. And Asa Combs ran the figures 3 times to be sure, because a man who had carried a false guilt for 11 years would put no claim before the world until he had checked it to the last cent. They found a freighter, a weathered old teamster named Bull Pruitt, who remembered hauling a heavy strongbox south for Halloran in the autumn of 1878 and being paid in new coin, and who remembered it because the man who hired him had told him with a smile not to trouble himself wondering what was inside. Piece by piece, document by document, they built around Halloran a wall of true paper, and not once did Della stand in front of him to do it. He did not know through all that summer that the depot had been opened at all. He believed, as he had believed for 11 years, that the ledger had burned with the camp, and that the only proof against him had gone up the canyon to die with the town. I want you to notice what she did not do, because it is the whole of what this story is. She never sought a single dollar for herself. She had bought the building, and the building had held the truth, and she might have taken the truth to Halloran and named her price for silence and lived comfortable the rest of her days. Men had grown rich on far less. The thought did not seem to occur to her, or if it did, it occurred the way a draft occurs in a sound house, noticed and shut out. The wages had belonged to 9 families. The truth belonged to them too. She was only the hand that had asked the lock thing its question, and the answer was not hers to sell. By the early autumn of 1889, a year, near enough, after she had counted $4 into a clerk's hand, Della Hart and Asa Combs laid the whole of it before the one titled man in this story, a territorial judge at the county seat who was old enough to remember Esther's reach and honest enough to be angered by what he was shown. She did not ask him to take her word. She gave him the ledger, the countersigned order in Halloran's own hand, the bank's deposit record, the freighter's account, the assayer's manifest, and the receipt the dead station master had folded into his coat. She gave him a case built entirely of things, not of accusations, and things are what a court is made to weigh. What happened to Halloran happened quietly, the way the truly heavy things often do. There was no confrontation in a street, no drawn weapon, no shouted reckoning. There was a summons, and there were documents he could not explain, and there was, in the end, the slow administrative collapse of a man whose comfort had been built on a single buried lie that was buried no longer. He resigned from the bank's board before the worst of it. He was made by the territory's own machinery to return what could be returned, and the land and the freight interests he had bought with stolen wages were sold to make the restitution real. He did not die in a gunfight or flee into the dark. He simply became, over the course of one autumn, a man whose name meant the opposite of what it had meant, and then a man whose name was not spoken, and the country that had once called him a builder learned to call him nothing at all. Della never saw his face. She had decided early that she did not need to, and she found, when it was done, that she had been right. The restitution itself was the work of another year, and it was the work she cared about. The recovered money, what the sale of Halloran's holdings could raise of it, did not come to $11,000, because 11 years spent a stolen thing down. Yet it came to enough that it could be divided, with the judge's order behind it, among what could be found of the 9 families. The blacksmith's widow received her husband's wages 11 years after they were due, and she was an old woman by then, and she sat a long while with the coin in her lap before she could say anything at all. Mercy Tolliver did not thank the territory, which had wronged her, and she did not thank the money, which was only money. She asked Della instead to sit with her, and the 2 women sat in the boarding house kitchen as the afternoon went long, and Mercy spoke of her husband for the first time in years as a man, and not as a stain on a wanted bill. His laugh, his trade, the way he had whistled at the forge, and Della understood that this was the true restitution, the giving back of a man to the woman who had loved him with his honor whole. The boy, who was now a man with children, received his father's portion, and he used it, he told Della, to put a true floor in a house that had stood on dirt, so that his own children would not grow up the way the robbery had made him grow up. The wages did what wages were always meant to do. They went into floors and roofs and seed, and the small dignities that a month's honest pay is supposed to buy, 11 years late, and worth, in some accounting that no ledger keeps, a great deal more for the lateness. And the name of Thomas Aldous Reed, which had hung on posts from the Silver Country to the Oregon line as the name of a thief, was taken down. The judge ordered it. The territory that had been so quick to print his guilt was slow and grudging to admit its error, the way institutions are. But Asa Combs would not let it rest, and Della would not let it rest, and in the end, the record was corrected. Reed had no family that anyone could find, no widow, no child, no grave that was marked. He had vanished into the country to save his life, and had paid for the truth with the whole of his name and his place in the world. The one thing left that could be given back to him was the truth itself, and Della saw that it was given. On the corrected record, beside his name, the territory entered the words the dead man had scratched into the iron of his own safe. Not Reed. Paid. He had been right. He had simply not lived to be believed. Della Hart did not grow rich. She had not meant to. When the restitution was finished and the record set right, she found that she had spent the better part of 2 years and most of what little she had on a thing that put no money in her own hand, and she did not seem to count it a loss. She kept the depot. That surprised the county, which had expected her to sell the lumber and move on. But she had grown fond of the place that had trusted her with its secret, and she had a notion, she said, of what it could be. She rebuilt it slowly with her own hands and the help of the man who had been a boy in Esther's reach, who came up the grade with his tools to repay a debt he insisted he owed. He brought his oldest boy with him on the long days, a child of 8 who fetched and carried and asked questions without end, and Della answered every one, because a question honestly asked was the thing she honored most in the world. They took the planks off the windows and let the light back in, and the room that had held its breath for 11 years filled slowly with the ordinary sounds of work, the rasp of a saw, the knock of a hammer, a man and a woman talking low across a task. She mended the platform where the frost had heaved it, setting new piers down to solid ground, the way a thing meant to last is set. She kept the schedule board on the wall with its chalked times of vanished trains, because some things are worth keeping as they are, and she set the black safe in the corner where it had always stood, its door open now, its face still scratched with the three words that had turned the country's story over in the dark. What the depot at Crail Siding became, in the years after, was a kind of office again, though no train ever stopped there anymore. People came to Della Hart the way they had once come to her grandfather, people with a locked thing and a question, people who had been told that something could not be opened or could not be proven or could not be set right. A widow with a strong box and no key. A family with a deed they could not find. A man whose good name had been taken by someone with more standing than he had. She did not turn them away. She had learned in that boarded building that the things the powerful are most sure are safely buried are the very things a patient hand can bring back into the light, and that a person dismissed as worthless might be carrying, all along, the one skill that undoes a comfortable lie. She worked at it the rest of her life. She trained 2 younger women in the ledger hand and the lock craft both, because a skill kept by only one person dies with that person, and she had seen too closely what is lost when the only one who knows the truth is gone. She grew old in the depot she had bought for $4, and the man who had been a boy in Esther's reach, who never did stop calling on her, brought his children up the grade to meet her, and his children brought theirs, so that the building that had been a place of bad luck no one would buy became, across 3 generations, a place people traveled to on purpose. In the last spring of her long life, the story is told, a great-granddaughter of that blacksmith's widow came up the canyon to see the depot she had heard about all her childhood, the place where a woman bought a building for $4 and brought a dead man's truth back into the day. Della was very old by then and did not work the locks anymore. But she walked the girl through the room and she showed her the schedule board and the cold stove, and at the last she showed her the safe in the corner with its door standing open and the 3 words scratched into its face. The girl asked her how she had known, that first day, that the boarded depot was worth opening when everyone else had been sure it was empty. And Della Hart, who had spent a life on the patient asking of locked things, gave the girl the only answer she had ever had, which was the one her grandfather had given her, worn smooth now by 60 years of use. A locked thing, she said, is only a question. The world had been so certain that the question had already been answered that no one had thought to ask it again. She had only asked. The girl went down the canyon at dusk, and Della stood on the mended platform in the last of the light, an old woman in a faded red shawl, her grandfather's tools long since passed to other hands, and she looked a while at the building that had given the Silver Country back its truth. The painted name above the door had been repainted years before, plain and clear, so that anyone could read it now. The wind came up the grade the way it always had, and in the corner of the room behind her, in the open iron safe that had kept its secret for 11 years and given it up to a patient hand, the 3 scratched words caught the last of the light and held it, the way true things do, long after the men who feared them are gone. What would you have done if you had been the one to count those $4 into a stranger's hand and walk down a forgotten track to a building everyone swore was empty? If a story like this one stays with you, there are others like it, waiting the way that Depot waited for someone willing to ask.